Testing. There we go. Okay, now I can hear. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to the ICA Pavilion, the home of sustainable agriculture of the Americas. My name is Margaret Ziegler, and I represent ICA in the United States. We are so happy to have you here. We've got a lot of energy going. We heard some really great conversations just before this, led by Danielle Nierenberg of Food Tank. We have a wonderful partnership with Food Tank this year. Danny and her whole team are here with us, and you guys have been great to work with. We love it. And we're moving quickly through our next series of discussions. We have a fabulous panel that's going to get started, but just to reiterate that this is the home of sustainable agriculture of the Americas, but we're open to conversations for supporting agriculture and sustainability with everybody all around the world. And so we're going to hear a lot today from farmers, from partners on the ground who are advancing policy, particularly for sustainable livestock. So we're going to try to answer the question, can livestock go green? And we think we can. We think we can do it. So I'm going to turn it over now to Danielle, who's going to say a few words, and she will introduce our keynote speaker, Muhammad Ibrahim from ICA.
Thank you, Margaret. Can we give Margaret a round of applause? She's done incredible work, and ICA has been such a fantastic partner for Food Tank. Again, I'm Danny Nierenberg with Food Tank. We are a research and advocacy organization really devoted to highlighting stories of hope and success in food and agriculture systems around the globe. That's why we're so excited to partner with ICA, because there are so many examples of what's happening across the Americas and across the world. The collaboration that we've had has been really amazing and transformative. I think these conversations are more important than ever given what's going on in the world, whether it's conflict or political tension. So thank you all for being here. Give yourselves a round of applause. I know COP has been a long slog, but you're doing great, and thanks for being here again. To kick us off, I get to introduce Dr. Muhammad Ibrahim, the Director of Technical Cooperation for ICA, for an opening keynote address, and he'll help set the stage for all of us for the conversations ahead. Please give him a round of applause.
Good morning. I was asked to make a brief presentation on what's the status of livestock and why are we discussing advancing and going green on the livestock systems. I've been working over the last 25 years on this subject, understanding what are the drivers. And if we are at the crossroads, because as you enter the gate this morning, I'm sure you've seen many people advocating for going vegan or alternative proteins, and looking at switching the diets and reconfiguration of the food systems, which also came out from the Eat Lancet report, and which also has been triggering this discussion about transforming the livestock systems. As I wait for the slides, can you put in the slides, please? Okay. So the question here is, I'm going to talk about what are the key drivers of change that affects livestock systems and their impacts on sustainability and resilience, and try to focus on what are the key drivers. I know there are many drivers in terms of income, the GDP, growth, etc., but focusing on what are the key drivers that are looking at the changes that moves livestock in the sector. As you can see there, livestock plays an important role, and therefore we need a more systemic approach in the discussion. What are the importance in terms of the economic growth with the SDGs, equitable livelihoods, food security and nutrition, sustainable ecosystems impacting land, water, and biodiversity, etc. And if you look at the numbers, you can see that many of the countries, the GDP, in terms of the contribution to agriculture GDP, livestock is playing an important role. However, the global debate, as I mentioned, on meat consumption with climate change and biodiversity is also triggering this discussion. And what I'm going to do is present some results to show you that we have been advancing in looking at alternatives for the livestock systems to reduce the ecological footprint. So the emission intensities has been one of the areas in terms of what the beef cattle or dairy cattle You can see in the whole of Latin America and some of the areas, emission intensities are rather high when you compare it to the other commodities, agriculture commodities. If you look at the value, the life cycle assessment, and therefore we've been working to look at what alternatives. I must say that there have been advances in terms of using additives like buffer and other different nutritional diets that we feed the cattle or ruminants, which is showing good results in terms of how do you reduce the emissions in these systems. Also, the discussion about deforestation in Latin America, a large percentage of the land still is for expansion for pastures, has also been triggering the discussion of what are the impacts on biodiversity loss, but also triggering the discussion in the trade policies. For example, the European Union has now a trade policy looking at beef, leveraging value chains for zero deforestation, and beef is one of those commodities, in addition to coffee, cocoa, oil palm, etc. These are some of the commodities that are on discussions, and I understood have detained the implementation of this policy for, whilst we are in the preparation phase. But also, within the region, we see that there are huge efficiency gaps with respect to production. And therefore, we need to accelerate the production, accelerate the implementation and scale up of climate-smart practices. These data are showing that in Africa now we see some advances, in Latin America, in some countries like Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. There are good examples in impacts on innovation and technology in terms of the advances and productivity of the systems. Doesn't advance. Okay. So some data from Embrapa and what we've been working on. We have started to look at the improved technologies. They have improved new varieties of grasses have been there, new forages that are well adapted, more productive systems. We've got associations with the legumes, which is also increasing productivity, but also reducing the use of inorganic fertilizers, reducing the emission of the footprints for the nitrous oxide, while at the same time reducing the emission intensities. We had a discussion on the use of bioinputs and some examples already of what are the impacts. Please. So what we did was many simulations to look at what are going to be the impacts of these different technologies and looking at sustainable intensification of the production systems. Please continue. And the data is showing, continue please. The data is showing that we can increase the productivity while very important, if you look at those circles, when you move from the traditional systems into different scales of intensification, we are reducing the total area for the production of 1,000 kilograms of beef by more than 7-fold of the area that you required. So the discussion of how do you free up lands for the semi-natural habitats, for the conservation of biodiversity, all important for carbon sequestration and biodiversity conservation. These data are showing convincingly of how we can green the livestock sector while at the same time addressing the issues under discussion. Also, I think while the debate is on looking at reconfiguration of the food systems, I think livestock as a part of the equation in mixed crop livestock systems will be very important in looking how do you produce more vegetables and what you're demanding for the nutritional diets, especially because of the role livestock played in nutrient cycling and the multiple roles it played in terms of improving the land and soil fertility, which we discussed over the last days in the discussions here. So, promoting more the mixed livestock, crop livestock systems, which you've seen in the case of soybean with livestock in Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay and some of these countries, I think there are good examples where they're advancing on how do you diversify the production systems. Next. Also looking at more tropicalized breed, understanding the temperatures are increasing. We've seen the impact on heat stress. I've measured the impact on heat stress And what are the impacts on productivity? We have improved productivity by only maintaining shared trees and pastures by more than 10 and 15% of the production. So some simple tools where farmers can adopt maintaining the silvopastoral systems and have been looking from a system approach, how do you improve the productivity of the systems? So here is a summary where we are showing the impacts of different levels of production systems and technologies. What are the impacts of reducing the baseline information and emission? And how much are you increasing the productivity if you're moving on pasture management or supplementation, silvopastoral systems and crossbreeding, etc. And we know there are good data outside there where if you're feeding the animals with additives, you can also reduce methane emissions from these animals during the enteric fermentation process. So there are good examples for how we can scale up these practices. Next. But also the IPCC has been using a lot of the metrics, most on temperate conditions, to look at what is the system emissions for tropical conditions. So we have been measuring the nitrous oxide emissions based on the data we've got, and we see that there's an overestimation of the emissions from the livestock systems, and we need to retool these metrics that we've got in the IPCC, which is very important, and the role that ICA is playing in terms of gathering information based on science and evidence. Next. So we have been advocating also the importance of pastures for carbon sequestration. We have good data which is showing we are increasing carbon by 1 to up to 3 tons of carbon sequestered per hectare per year, and being part of the solution for mitigation to climate change, understanding how there's a large percentage of our area on the pastures. Next. So I'm going to show you some examples how these data has been advanced into policies. Many of the countries have got the livestock in the NDCs. Honduras is one of the countries we've been working on for the llamas, on the llama livestock. Next, please. And our data on the llama livestock, if you're adopting these technologies and understanding that they need to report on the results on reducing emissions, you can see over time we are reducing the emissions from the livestock sector by changing the systems, that they are adopting the systems which I presented earlier in the slides. Also, biodiversity is very important. Our data is showing that depending on the configuration and the land use practices, if you use a landscape approach, integrating a matrix of different silvopastoral and good pasture systems, we can conserve the biodiversity. And we have used some of these indicators to show how you can reconfigure the landscape to produce beef and milk, but also conserving biodiversity and also reducing the carbon footprint. Next. Also, I have tested the payment of ecosystem services, and payment for ecosystem services do have an impact on adoption of technologies. Countries like Costa Rica and Colombia and all these countries now have been adopting these tools as part of the solution to scale up and working with the farmers' organizations and the private sector to implement these tools for payment of ecosystem services. Next, Uruguay now has been labeling the beef for carbon neutrality. You can see that they are greening the livestock. It's moving in the positive direction. And we need more an alliance of the public-private sector to advance, taking advantage of the policies that have been implemented and using these examples to advance on these areas. Next. I've put some information what we need to do at scale. I'm sure in the panel you're going to have a discussion in terms of organization, technical assistance, using of digital tools for precision agriculture, but also looking at incentives. What are the policies that we need to look at? Building the markets. What are you going to do in terms of branding? We know in Brazil, in Mato Grosso already, they've been doing jurisdictional certification of the schemes to reduce the transaction costs. And we should build and capitalize on those experiences that we have. Next. And I have a last question for the panelists, if you want analysis. The question is, we have good data in reducing the emission intensities. What will be the economic frontiers that will maintain the balance to reduce to the respond to the NDCs? New Zealand have made good strides in reducing the emission intensities, but the problem, they have expanded the herd, and therefore they can't reduce the baseline information they have had in the NDCs. So I think the challenge there, what will be the threshold values that we're going to work on into livestock? So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. That was wonderful. Thank you for setting the stage and being so eloquent in your remarks. We're going to go from here to start with our first panel of the day. So joining this conversation, we have Amanda Soros Rosa, a technical advisor for the Brazilian Confederation of Agriculture and Livestock. Please give her a round of applause as she joins the stage. John Gilliland, a livestock producer who serves as an advisor to the UK Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board. Give him a round of applause, please. And then joining us very soon, we hope, she's on her way, is Josefine Eisel, the Director for Latin America at the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. Wonderful, yay. Yay. She's here, that's great. So I'm so pleased. Give them all a round of applause, please. Bigger. I'm so pleased to be sitting with all of you. Thank you for being here. Josefina, since you are here, I'm going to start with you. I had a whole different plan before. The Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef has a commitment to reduce the net global warming of beef by 30% by 2030 through sustainability goals. Can you talk about what those goals look like? And we're about 5 years away from 2030. So.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I had a problem with an overlap of two panels, so I had to run from the two zones. We have launched our global goals on 2020. We had already been working on sustainability. It was not that we started at 2020. GRSP exists since 2010. So we started with our principles and criteria where we work, of course, on carbon, water, biodiversity, animal welfare, etc. But of course, when we were heading to 2020, all the climate, the deforestation of biodiversity and animal health and other goals that we have launched were kind of a top priority. So we had to be accountable for that. We had to show that we were making progress. So far, we were just building our network, just working on improved practices. But we were not communicating the progress we were doing. We were not measuring that. So that's how we started. And yeah, it has been a challenge. We have just published our first report, our first progress report, where we show how are all our countries. We work in 25 countries with 13 national roundtables. So how they're making progress. Some of them is taking more time, especially in Latin America, just to develop their plans. They need to build more capacity. They need to be more because all the programs, they were mainly conducted by farmer associations, but now they realize they need to work very close with the research institute, because they need to measure. So that has taken some time, in some countries less than others. But we are making progress. As I said, we have our first report, and the plans for the next 5 years are very ambitious.
Sure.
We really hope we can achieve them. And it's not that we have to start doing things that hasn't been done. It's just about reporting those, measuring those. So
sure.
The challenge is more about the measure and just showing that in.
The transparency of the roundtable is really important. It's important to people like me who look for that. Can you talk about, how the countries you work with are following sort of that transparency rule that you have in place?
Yeah, of course. All our meetings are open to all our members, and whoever wants to join as an observer also is welcome to join. We have in our roundtable all the constituencies. We have the civil society, which also help us to bring a different perspective, also to be transparent, to report also all the reports that we have based on science, but also we have ways to show that they are true and, as I said, based on science. And we have open meetings and closed meetings to our members, but we have everything recorded, and whoever wants to know what we do, we are always open to share about our work.
And just one final sort of thought before I turn to the other panelists. When you're talking about meeting these specific goals, if you don't meet them, will you be able to communicate that effectively and in a way that shows people that, listen, we're trying, right?
Yeah, it's a good question. First, our goals, we call them aspirational goals. That's where we would like to be. It's not that we sign something that if we don't commit it, we have to pay someone's back. So
Sure.
it's aspiration, trying to drive the whole industry, the whole supply chain towards one direction. A lot of them are already doing things. So for us,
Right.
it's more about communication, about data, and about kind of a common ambition and a common pathway. So of course, that's why we are, from now on, we are going to report every 2 years, but every year we will have all the records just to make sure that we have everything in place. We just decided on 2 years because it was not feasible to collect reports
Sure.
worldwide from all our members. But yeah, if we don't achieve them, of course, we need to communicate that, and that's about also transparency and honesty and pointing out which are the challenges and why we haven't been.
And that honesty and transparency creates so much more trust than in the past. And I think that's such a great sort of advancement moving forward. Thank you. John, if I can turn to you, I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the methane management techniques that farmers are implementing. And then also along with that, is that enough? What they're implementing now, is that enough?
Well, everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
So for us, we look at the whole system of livestock production and not just methane. Because let's face it, the science of methane hasn't been put to bed. It has on nitrous oxide. It has in CO2. So the system approach, and at the end of the day, first and foremost, I'm a farmer and I've led from the front as a farmer. So my journey has been about building from the ground up. So I want measurements that actually pick up the consequences of my behavioral change. So the bits that we've been focusing on actually are wider than that because the animal sits in a landscape. And so we've been really at the forefront of measuring change in carbon stocks. And sorry, I'm going to slightly turn to you and hopefully this will work. Thank you very much. So one of the key things, so we went on this journey, we wanted to put it into an international context. This is taken from an FAO publication last year and really putting our journey in context. Is it dietary change?
Right.
Is it building carbon stocks? Well, actually, what are the FAO advising? We need to do twice the heavy lifting in taking carbon out of the sky and putting it in our soils and trees. So that's been our main focus on that. Let's see if I can get this to work again. Next slide. Can I? So from us at an individual farm level, so I chair a group of 7 farms, including my own farm. We are on a journey to net zero. And I say net, not gross. So that is about working what are our emissions, but what are our carbon stocks, how they changed. So the key thing we want to do as farmers was know our numbers. We knew we had emissions, we knew we removed carbon, but we didn't know how much and where.
Right.
And so we focused on the baselining, the benchmarking, we measured our emissions, our carbon stocks, trees, hedges, to get our net position. And from that, it gave us knowledge. We then changed our behavior, but from a position of information.
Right.
This is a knowledge-based journey as
course.
such, and we did it in a way that delivered other public goods. Next slide, please. And really, the big knowledge gap on any journey around carbon removals, and particularly with livestock in them, is up until now, we have never been measuring change in carbon stocks robustly enough. So for us, we use aerial LiDAR. We scan our landscape at 40 scans per square meter. We do it every 5 years. So we physically measure change. In our soils, we're measuring to a meter. And we're stratifying that 0 to 15 centimeters, 15 to 30, 30 to 60, 60 down. So not only can we see the change in the carbon, total carbon, but we can see where it is in the soil.
Right.
So as we go, as Mohammed said earlier on, as we switch from a monoculture of perennial ryegrass, we go to legumes, herbs in our grass, we're getting more carbon and we're getting it deeper. And this technology, we can pick it up because we can tell the story then and tell the story with integrity.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. On my own particular farm, I've been working with Wageningen University in research. I have 5 totally different land uses. The big debate in Europe at the moment is land use change. Get rid of animals, plant trees. I have asked, and I've played the critical friend to the science community, show me where this has been done historically, and are there any perverse consequences? Well, On my case, I have a unique landscape of 5 different land uses. I have energy crops and willow trees. I have silver pasture, 200-year-old permanent pasture, 30-year-old oak trees, 250-year-old oak trees.
Yeah.
Really, next slide, please. And really what we wanted to do is we wanted to go under the bonnet and look at the biology out there. And really what did we find is anywhere that we had feces being defecated in the ground, we had immense earthworms. We had really good soil respiration, really good fungi communities. The story that isn't told is the benefit of having livestock feces in the soil.
Right.
Next slide, please. And I'm not the only one saying that. Certainly in Europe in the last 18 months, we've now had 3 new papers published in this area, clearly flagging up the role of livestock in regenerating soils and driving soil health, driving carbon removals. Next slide, please. And so what I've been able to do, because I'm also a policy advocate, is I've been able to get under the bonnet of our government in Belfast. And 4 years ago, they announced that they were going to baseline the whole country. So we are now measuring every field, every tree, every hedge. It's a £38 million scheme. We're giving training. It's a voluntary scheme. We've got 3/4 of it done. And 92% of farmers in Northern Ireland have signed up, which is unprecedented.
Sure.
The key thing we succeeded in doing is getting government to recognise that really good MRV to give integrity is a public good. Behavioural change is up to the industry.
Sure.
But if we want integrity, that is the bit that the public government should step in.
Absolutely.
And that is the big win that we won. Next slide, please. So really, the challenge we have, and sorry, these slides are out of date because I gave this presentation in Scotland, is really how do we deliver all of this? You know, how do we baseline, measure, and manage with forensic integrity?
Yeah.
How do we participate in the public debate about what a healthy diet is for humans? And how do we empower farmers with knowledge? So talk with farmers, not talk at farmers.
Right on.
And that's been absolutely our drive.
That's great. That's great. There's a lot to unpack here. First of all, I want to visit your farm. Second of all, I want to talk a little bit about the role of mixed crop livestock systems, because that was brought up before. Can you sort of dig in more, if you will, about what happens when manure is left in soil and can help those microorganisms grow?
Well, what people forget is a soil has a microbiome just like a gut of a cow has a microbiome. A healthy soil should have a microbiome that is a mirror image to the microbiome of the gut of a cow. And it stands to reason. Why? Is when an animal defecates, it inoculates it, the soil with its feces, okay? Our carbon in our soil will never be permanent, and anyone says it's permanent is misplaced. But what it does do, it lives, and it is, it is accelerated. Its growth is accelerated by that microbiome as such. And keeping that healthy, and for us there are 2 key things. One is having feces returned, and the second one is keeping the soil at optimal pH, because your microbiome is completely pH sensitive. And it's one of the things I first learned when I went off to college is actually soil pH is so important, and it's been neglected.
Absolutely.
So in Ireland and across the British Isles, our livestock production is predominantly around a monoculture of perennial ryegrass and as much synthetic nitrogen as we can use. So really what we've been doing over this last 6-7 years is looking to walk away from that, bring legumes and herbs back into that, but putting the science around it. Because we have a lot of passion in regenerative agriculture, but we've very little science quantifying it.
Sure.
And so the research farm I was involved in the Republic of Ireland, we had 5 PhD students with Wageningen University Research and University College Dublin quantifying the benefit of this change.
Yeah.
And we got change. I mean, we reduced nitrogen by 70%. We increased overall herbage productivity by 30%. We got extra live weight gain in beef by 17% and in lamb by 32%. Overall, we reduced our carbon footprint by 28% in 1 year, and we got 300% more earthworms. We really proved that we could go on this journey, make more money, drive resilience, and get our footprint down and still deliver good quality food for a balanced diet.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you for all of that, John. And I'll come back to you in a minute. Amanda, I want to go to the other side of the world and talk about what farmers and ranchers are doing in Brazil to reduce emissions, not just methane, as John pointed out, but nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide.
Okay, so Brazilian producers has been committed to sustainability for at least 15 years right now. At least since the launch of the ABC plan, which is the low carbon agriculture plan that we have in Brazil. It establishes and spreads a whole bunch of technologies that are able to reduce carbon in a lot of agriculture and livestock systems,
Sure.
not only on livestock. We have integrated systems, we have waste management, we have lots of technologies that are able to reduce these emissions. As the director told us, we have been able to study and to insert these technologies in our farms in Brazil, but we have been having an issue with transparency and reporting. So what we saw is that in the last 15 years, we had a reduction in enteric fermentation emissions, which is the highest ones that we have in Brazil. But we had a reduction in those emissions, even though our cattle herd increased. So this kind of showcases how we are able to reduce these emissions
Right.
on farm in Brazil, even though we're not able to measure carbon on land in a wide way.
Right.
So we are struggling to have access to technology and to enhance our inventories in Brazil to really showcase what we have been actually doing.
Right.
And this is where we're struggling. But even though we have been able to improve our systems and to do right now in Brazil pasture recovery plan
Nice.
that has the objective of increasing carbon sequestration from pastures and to enhancing productivity in the agriculture and livestock sector in Brazil. So to sum it up, we have a lot of examples. We have science that keeps us in place, but we are struggling to report this.
Sure.
And that's how we stand in Brazil right now.
That's often the struggle for these kinds of issues. I want to turn to both Josefina and Amanda. One thing that bothers me, and I'm sure it bothers you both as well, is that farmers and ranchers are often blamed for destroying the Amazon, for destroying grasslands. And I wonder what sort of policies can be in place to make sure, you talked about pasture recovery plans, what kinds of policies can be in place that help farmers, create more environmental sustainability, create more economic sustainability, so that they can survive and thrive without having to destroy forests or do any of the other things that they're often, blamed for, but are not actually, they're put in a position where they have to do that.
Okay, so first of all, it's impossible to talk about sustainability in Brazil without talking about the forest code. So this is a huge policy that we have, and that ensures that producers in Brazil are responsible for the preservation of at least 33% of forests that we have in the country. 33% of forests in Brazil are actually inside farmers' proprietors,
Right.
and it's their responsibility to keep the forest up there. So this is a huge policy. It took us very long in a way, but I think Brazil is improving its policy, its environmental policy, by starting to integrate it with economic incentives to keep forests
Right.
up. So first of all, we're developing our carbon market now. Agricultural sector probably won't have a cap, and one of the reasons is this transparency issue that we have been
Sure.
dealing with.
Sure.
But agriculturists in Brazil are really willing to be providers of carbon credits, which I think it's a huge opportunity, first of all, to increase the inventories that we have. So it will get incentive for the farmers to build their own inventories, and maybe we can enhance our reports by doing this.
Sure.
And this gives us a really good perspective for the future. But it's really, really important that our carbon credit is correctly specified.
Right.
Yeah, because if we have a cheap carbon credit, you don't have enough incentive, and if the carbon credit is too costly, it won't be able to do what it has to do.
Right.
So this is vital for Brazil, and this is one of the things that I think that are going to really help us to achieve more forest protection and forest recovery. And also, we are working with the sustainable taxonomy in Brazil, And I think this will be able to redirect investment flows for people that are willing to, first of all, include sustainable practices, improve sustainable practices, and also to benefit from it in an economic way. So
That's key, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Otherwise, none of this works.
Yes, and I think this is a way to ensure that we have protection aligned with economic goals that all farms obviously have. And we can align the productive enhancement and forest protection alongside livestock systems and agricultural systems. So in a policy perspective, I think that's what's going on for Brazil, and I think we have great perspectives regarding economic instruments. We need to get farmers to access financing for include sustainable practices in their proprietors. This is vital, not only for sustainability, but for productivity and food security. So that's...
Thank you for that. Josefina, do you agree around the need for financing? I know you do. It's a silly question, but the need for ensuring that carbon markets can actually do the things that they're supposed to do as well.
Yes, of course. And I truly believe that without financing, without support from governments, from private institutions, it's very hard to move the sustainability progress. I also want to talk about maybe in Argentina we also have a forest code. Along with the forest code, there was a program that is called in Spanish Manejo de Bosque con Ganadería Integrada, which is how to manage the forest with integrated livestock. And that was a kind of an incentive from the government to keep the forest and also with training. So there are many. Besides the policies, there need to be kind of different programs that come together with the policies where the farmers first know how to produce and conserve. So that's very important, and that needs a lot of technical advice, a lot of kind of institutional work among different institutions, not only the farmers, research, government, so farmers associations. So that example is one thing that maybe didn't roll out as much as it should. There were not enough incentives, not enough financial support to that kind of programs. But those are the programs that I see that they come together with the policies, not just the policy, but to make the laws kind of being accomplished, you need to have some support, some other programs, and from private sector and public sector both.
Absolutely, and I want to remind us all that I've never met a farmer or rancher who wants to destroy the environment. They are put in a position where they have no other option, and it's very important to understand that. And I also want to talk about sort of the culture of livestock farming and ranching. This is something that this is part of agriculture that we need to preserve and enhance. How do we create this just transition so that farmers and ranchers can feel like that they're, obviously that they're making the money that they need to support their families and thrive, but also contributing to environmental and sustainability goals? And John, maybe you can go first.
Well, this is so relevant, and so many farms are family farms, particularly where I come from. And I think the current British government have just walked off a cliff on this one here, because they've just reintroduced inheritance tax on family farms. And the streets of London on Tuesday are going to be bunged by very angry farmers, because people don't realise the emotional attachment to their animals, but also to their land. I'm a 5th generation farmer. I have the 6th and the 7th already on the farm.
Nice.
I, as a family farmer, more than anyone else, so my definition of sustainability is to make sure I pass on the family farm in better shape than when I inherited it.
Of course.
That's what drives me as a family farmer, and I will argue 99% of other family farmers are exactly the same.
Sure.
What we don't get over maybe is we articulate that properly, and we've seen that now immediately in the last 2 weeks in the United Kingdom, where suddenly an urban government has come in and they've just said, oh, we're going to tax all of these in the vital transition.
That rural and urban sort of conversation needs to happen more, so that the urban folks understand what's happening in rural areas.
And it's becoming a bigger, as our generations move on, as urban people become 3, 4, 5 generations from the land.
Right.
It's never a problem with a first generation or a second generation from the land. It's that disconnect that actually, beef comes from the retailer, it doesn't come from a cow. That lack of... So on my farm, we participate in a thing called Open Farm Weekend, My farm is inside a city, the city of Derry in Northern Ireland. We opened in June time for Saturday and Sunday. We had 1,700 people came to
Nice.
visit our farm.
Yeah.
We were overwhelmed. I do think there is a renaissance. I do think that urban people suddenly waking up, and I think COVID helped. During COVID, we had a lot of people who couldn't go out and eat out, went back to actually cooking, buying raw materials, and they reconnected.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so actually, the key challenge we have as a farming community is getting more and more urban people out on farms to actually see, whether it's livestock production, whether it's plant-based, but it doesn't make any difference. It's getting them see
Right.
how is food produced today in the modern world.
That connection's important. Josephina, how does the Global Roundtable look at this idea of a just transition for livestock farmers?
Yeah, of course, as you said, financing is one of the main areas. So we are focusing on having more projects, trying to bring more funds to implement more projects with farmers. So far, we have been working on developing criteria and developing all these metrics. But I think that having more projects supporting farmers, bringing, as I said, the research, all the
Right.
science to the farmers, it's important. But also the incentive is important. Farmers, they're already doing things in the farm, as John just said. But also, if the world wants them to do more, to have to even sequester more carbon or be more efficient, someone needs to recognize and to pay for that. At
Hear,
least
hear.
as a starting point. And so a nice project could. I think the long term of that project, the farmer can implement a project, but to really adopt it for the long term, also there need to be some incentive on the market on that. So that's
Very quickly, John, sorry.
So one of the big challenges is governments actually know we can remove carbon. If carbon was $100 tomorrow, we would deliver carbon removals. Their scare is we would switch off food production. Now, that's not my fault. I will respond to whatever the market signals are at the moment. The politicians have to make a decision. You cannot beat us up because we're only delivering food at the moment. If you want us to do this, we will do this. The one thing modern farming has shown is we have risen to every challenge that we've been asked to do. The challenge that politicians have is they do not know how to balance rewarding farmers for carbon,
Sure.
rewarding farmers for food. And that's that nexus that they have to cross, and they're going to have to cut us some slack.
Yeah.
We can't do both without getting proper recognition.
A good reason we need more farmers in policymaking. Amanda, how do we have a just transition, especially in a place like Brazil, where it's very difficult to encourage policymakers to really help farmers?
No, so first of all, meat is an important part of Brazilian culture in general, not only from the farmer side, but also from the consumer side.
Right.
So it is very relevant that in Brazil, I don't think personally that we'll have a demand shift that is as huge that meat loses its importance on our nutritional value that we have in the country. So this is one thing that we need to take in account when we're designing public policy, because we have to make the signals right so that our production is efficient, efficient in emissions and efficient in meat production in general.
Right.
So this is a huge thing that we need to address when we're thinking about just transition.
Yeah.
The other thing is that we have to make ways to keep farmers on land, because no farmer wants to abandon its land,
No.
but they need to have a way to survive from the land.
Absolutely.
So having meat adequately priced and have natural resources adequately priced. And I think we're going towards this direction in Brazil, because when farmers are responsible for keeping forests up, they kind of create an attachment to land. So and it's costly, and they need to have ways to have income for production, for survival, and for forest protection.
Sure.
We need to have ways that farmers are not only rewarded, but that they have help to ensure that forests are protected in farm. And in this way, we can create a just transition in a sense that meat will be produced aligned with sustainability goals, and we will ensure that we have the nutritional value that comes from meat while we have sustainability, and we can make the world keep going and keep being able to produce not only meat but other agricultural crops.
Absolutely.
So we need to think in a way that they are attached to land and that they are responsible for forests in a way that they already are, but that they are able to do it while keeping on farms.
Absolutely, and I think that just demonstrates the point that we just don't want farmers and ranchers to survive these challenges. We want them to thrive throughout these challenges. We are sadly out of time. Thank you all. Please give the panelists a round of applause. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Thank you. We are now going to turn to our next keynote address from Jack Bobo, who is the director of the Food Systems Institute at the University of Nottingham, and he's going to talk about the diversification of protein sources as a possible solution. So please give Jack a round of applause.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank the organizers for allowing me to be here. I'd like to thank Lloyd and Margaret. I'd like to thank Danny and Bernie for their contributions. Normally I talk with slides, but Margaret told me that I couldn't, so I'm a little bit like an Italian that can't use their hands, so you'll have to bear with me. I'm going to talk to you today about radical collaboration, and I'm going to explain to you what that means and why it's important. The problems we face are big, they're complex, and they're global. And they cannot be achieved without collaboration. And yet collaboration today is in very short supply, as we see in the negotiations. Collaboration for most of us means bringing people together who share a common vision so that they can scale the impact of the work they do. What I mean about radical collaboration is bringing together people who fundamentally disagree as to what happens to work together to create a shared vision. This sounds hard. It might even sound impossible. But we need to stop collaborating to take others down, and we need to start collaborating to build others up. So what does this mean and what does it look like? The physicist Niels Bohr once said, "The opposite of a fact is a lie. But the opposite of a profound truth may very well be another profound truth." So it can be true that we cannot save the planet without organic, regenerative, agroecology. And it may also be true we cannot save the planet without conventional and industrial agriculture. It may be true that we cannot save the planet without livestock. And it may be true that we cannot save the planet without alternative proteins. What does all of this mean in practice? So I want to give an example of what it might mean to bring together two fundamentally different groups to create a shared vision. And so I want to use the example of the future of protein. I've spent the last year and a half talking to thousands and thousands of beef and dairy producers, as well as alternative protein companies, about this shared future. And I have three scenarios for the future of protein. Scenario one, I call livestock wins. We meet our future protein needs 25 to 50% more protein by expanding animal agriculture. Scenario two, alternative proteins win. We meet our future demand by expanding alternative proteins. And then scenario three, we produce significantly less animal protein in 2050. And then I ask those beef and dairy producers, which future is best for you? They all raise their hand and say scenario one, livestock wins. But then I point out, in that scenario, we add 20 to 40 billion animals to the planet. We cut down 10% of our forest to make way for livestock production in fields. And most importantly, they don't make more money. Because if demand increases and supply increases, your income is flat. That's basic economics. In scenario 2, if demand increases but supply of real meat is flat, you have to make more money. And we don't have to cut down nearly as much forest. Well, scenario 3, we could reduce production. There are countries like Denmark and Netherlands that are already choosing to do it. But there are also places that are seriously unproductive. The 25% least productive livestock production in the world uses 60% of the pasture land. We could either make it dramatically more efficient, or maybe we can get rid of some of it. I don't know. But the point is, if we reduce production, everybody else makes 4 or 5 times more money. And then I ask them again, what future is best for you? Is best for your family? Is best for the planet? And we go from 95% raising their hand for livestock wins to 95% agreeing that it's one of the other scenarios that is best for them and best for the world. If we can get the livestock sector and the alternative protein sector to agree on a shared vision for the future of protein, we can bring anybody together. And so the challenge we have is not just to produce more and more and more food forever. The reality is, after 2050, population growth slows dramatically. We are not having more children. We have already reached peak child. The number of children born next year will be less than this year, and less the year after that, and the year after that, and the year after that. The challenge, every day between now and 2050, it gets harder to feed the world. But every day after 2050, it will get easier to feed the world if we haven't screwed things up. So the next 25 years will not only be the most important 25 years in the 10,000-year history of agriculture, and they're the most important 25 years there will ever be in the history of agriculture. And that's why we need to get it right. And that's why the work you're doing is so important. And that's why we need to come together to create a shared vision so that the politicians in the other room know exactly what we need to do and can't claim that we have no idea and that we're disagreeing. So if we can do this radical collaboration, I have no doubt that agriculture will, in fact, save the planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so intriguing and provocative. Thank you so much, Jack. I love this idea of having uncomfortable conversations. It's what I've spent my career doing, so I want to thank Jack for doing it as well. In our next fireside chat, we're going to talk about how we encourage a greener future for the livestock industry through public policy and that radical collaboration that Jack spoke so much about. So I get to introduce our panelists. First, we have the wonderful Krista Harden, who is the president and CEO of the U.S. Dairy Export Council. A big round of applause for her, please. Eric Mittenthal, who is the Chief Strategy Officer for the Meat Institute and the leader of the Protein Pact. Big round of applause. Hey, Eric. And I think we have Martin Fraguero, who is, and I mispronounced your last name, who is founder and director of Carbon Group at Agroclimate Solutions. Welcome. Big round of applause for them all. Thank you so much. Krista, I'm going to put you on the spot because we talked about this yesterday. I'm wondering if you can talk about how the U.S. Dairy Export Council is working to reduce methane emissions and sort of, spreading, because it's the Dairy Export Council, how you're helping other nations sort of learn about those things.
Okay, great. Thank you, and thanks to be with my panelists. This is going to be a fun discussion, and thanks to Jack. Boy, good, thought-provoking challenges for all of us, and I will take heed of your words. The Dairy Export Council consists of all the dairy farmers in the U.S., for folks who don't know, all 28,000 Plus, we have about 115 or so processors, cooperatives, allied industry members as well. So we kind of bring everybody together. We don't actually do research ourselves, but we rely on our farmers and their investments through the checkoff program at DMI, Dairy Management, Inc., to make sure we have good science, we have good data that we can share with the world as we're talking about who's producing U.S. dairy products. A couple initiatives that I'm very proud of. One is called the Greener Cattle Initiative, and it also includes the beef folks as well as dairy, and we have a consortium that comes together, and it's partially funded by the Foundation for Food and Agriculture. And a disclaimer, I sit on that board, but the project was already underway when I joined the board, so I had nothing to do with it, but I'll take credit now. And it's really helping to look at methods that can help cattle be greener. It's a very ambitious. Grants have just been put out for folks to do research and data collection. So I'm pleased that our industry is involved in that. The farmers themselves also kind of are doing things as well. There's a program called FarmES, and I'll try to get this acronym right. I know the acronym and what it stands for. You have to really, make yourself think about it. Farmers Assuring Responsible Management and Environmental Stewardship.
Nice job.
I got it right. 3.0 is out right now, and it really is giving farmers methods and the ability to track, to communicate, to collaborate on their own environmental stewardship.
Sure.
So they're really looking at these issues. But there's also just a number of opportunities that we try to take advantage of in dairy, recognizing that methane is an issue that the public is concerned about, our customers are concerned about around the world, and there's things that we can do to make improvements. We can talk about that maybe now or later with additives,
Sure.
with changes in rations and diets, other kind of management. We also can do certainly with our waste products and manure, with covering digesters, some simple things in flaring. There's composting. There's a number of tools that are available if they're affordable,
Right.
and can be scaled. But yet we don't have all the answers. We'll admit that, but we're trying for them.
That affordability point is so important to this conversation, because if we want farmers to do, what we're discussing here, reduce their methane emissions, reduce all of their other emissions, if they can't afford those technologies or innovations or the simple things like feeds, then all of this is for naught. So how do we make it affordable for farmers and ranchers to do this?
Well, I think there's a number of ways, and we've talked a lot about this cannot be the burden of just the farmer. There is absolutely no way they can stay in business if we're expecting them to make these great strides, these great changes in the way they farm, how they farm, without increase in price of product. We also talk a lot about will consumers pay more for these products if they're produced sustainably. They say they will, but then maybe they really don't. So we have to have partnerships with the governments. I think very pleased that our government right now does have grants and programs that help farmers who are willing and are interested to be able to at least try and to adapt some of these practices.
Sure.
Obviously, there's risk involved in that as well.
Yeah.
You don't know if they'll all work, so you have to have that. We also work with the private sector as well to make sure that they're investing. Some of our biggest suppliers are investing in these efforts with us in the dairy industry. The Nestle's, the Starbucks of the world. It takes all of us coming together. It really does, but it cannot be just at the burden of the farmer.
Thank you. Thank you. The perfect point to end on for this particular section. But I also want to get back maybe in a little while to experimentation, because I think that's an important part of this. If we can find ways to experiment. Eric, you and I have talked a lot over the years, and we have often disagreed, but Jack's presentation reminded me how important it is for you and I to talk, because I really do like you. We disagree on a lot, but I enjoy talking to you because I always learn something. And I think that's what we want to take away from a lot of these conversations, that folks can disagree on certain issues, but still have, wonderful conversations where we learn from one another. And so I'm wondering, Krista made this point about giving farmers the opportunity to have methods and practices and the ability to collaborate so that they can create both environmental and economic sustainability. Can you talk a little bit about that from your perspective with the Protein Pact and the Meat Institute?
Yeah, sure. I didn't realize we disagreed so much, so many things. But I agree.
We're keeping it secret.
I enjoy these conversations that we have and really value. And I think one of the things that I've taken away from our conversations and from engagements at COP and other events over the years is the opportunity to have conversations that might be uncomfortable, where disagreement might occur, and so that's a place where we want to be to make sure that we're finding the common ground with folks who may not always agree with us. So for us at the Meat Institute, where I'm Chief Strategy Officer, we are working together. Collaboration is a major focus of what we do. We represent meat companies across the U.S. that produce 95% of the red meat, majority of the poultry as well. And the Protein Pact, which is what we lead, is our strategy to both collectively work with our members to in a common way to report data across a variety of different metrics. I'm going in and out. I see. I'm holding the mic wrong. Okay, very good. Thank you, Margaret. And we are also working across the supply chain. So working really closely with dairy and have learned a great deal from dairy and the work that they've been doing. They really are the forerunners of in the animal agriculture sector of what's possible and how we can apply that to the meat sector. Working really closely with the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef and beef producers around the U.S., the Global Roundtable as well. Working really closely with the Pork Board and pork producers across the U.S. and North America, as well as feed producers as well. And so it's really about how do we create a toolbox for all of the different sectors to have the resources that they need, both from the meat company perspective, working with restaurants and retailers as well, which we've advanced quite a bit, and then the farmers and ranchers too, to have a whole supply chain approach that makes progress, is backed by data, and is done so in a very collaborative manner. Yeah,
that collaboration is key. Martin, Eric talked about a toolbox, and I'm wondering if you can talk about how we go about monitoring, reporting, and verifying the impacts of programs and initiatives that are their intent is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We need a toolbox to do that, and we need different ways of measurement.
Yeah, I think when we think about farming and ranching in general, what I think we have to have in mind, right, is that the ranchers and farmers have a very peculiar capacity, and that is the capacity to observe and understand what happens in their environment.
Right.
They work, or we work, with living organisms, right? Each animal is an individual. Each plant on our pastures is also an individual, but as a group, as a pasture, they have their ecophysiology aspects that make it so different. So when we start to understand that we need to monitor and report on greenhouse gas emissions and our carbon sequestration, those aspects are not easy to understand from a normal person, because in most times they're counterintuitive, right? So we need to help these people that have that capacity to observe and to understand what's happening to their herds, if they're being productive or not, if they're performing adequately or not, how to incorporate those type of elements which are quantitative and quite complex, and how to make those understandable from a consumer or a value chain or downstream value chain perspective. So I think that is one of the challenges today, and I think IECA is doing a great job into focusing, on how we need, and as Krista was just mentioning, how we make consumers understand that they have a responsibility in understanding what the challenges are on the other end of the value chain.
Absolutely.
And how for decades we've been seeing farmers' income decrease, receiving less and less, while at the same time consumers we're paying more and more.
Right.
And so we need to recover that percentage of income for the farmer, because there is a huge challenge, not only in the historical things that managing crops and livestock mean, but also these new aspects that you're asking on how can we monitor, how can we demonstrate society that those intangibles, right, of greenhouse gas emission mitigation, on the performance on not only food production and food safety or security, but also on the greenhouse gas balance and how we can drive CO2 from the atmosphere and keep it in soils and in ecosystems.
Thank you for that. And you know, we talked so much about transparency on the previous panel, and you know, this keeps coming up, and it has to be something that we talk about. I wonder how you each think of creating more transparency in the work that you do. Krista.
I agree, and I think part of that is being, you know, having to admit sometimes when you don't have the answer, you're not achieving your goals. You know, talking about the bad news as well as the good news.
Right.
No whitewashing, really telling a full story. And my experience has been when you're honest, when you're transparent, when you say we don't know,
Right.
or it didn't work out the way we thought it would, and we're going to keep trying, that there's acceptance and better understanding. It's when we're shyer or more reluctant to
Cagey.
tell the full story, or cagey, or just like, you hate to admit you're wrong.
Right.
You know, it's just human nature. You don't want to say, I don't know.
Right.
But we have to do that. And I've been very proud of the U.S. dairy industry because I think we do that as best we can. And farmers will say, this isn't working for me. I can't afford this right now. I've got to step back, or I can't make the same investment. And I think when we're not meeting our goals or we're a little short on things, we just have got to be radically honest.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even if it makes us uncomfortable and even if it's discouraging.
I would just want to stay with you for 1 second more, because dairy farmers in the United States have suffered so much. It's hard for them to be transparent because they're scared of literally losing their farms. And I think that's an important point to bring out. Can you talk a little bit about what dairy farmers are experiencing in the U.S.?
Well, it's been a very tough years. I have my chair sitting right here, and so I hate to speak for her. I always am a little reluctant to do that, but I will, Marilyn. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I think it has been a very tough years, you know, the last few years. This year is a little bit better because feed costs are down. That's not so good for our grain friends, but things come in cycles. But it has been very tight margins. It's very difficult to convince the next generation to come back to the farm. So we are seeing farmers go out of business, not only for economics, or just for the fact they don't have a family member or someone close by to take over. So we've seen changes in our industry because of that, which makes it very difficult. But, so sometimes making that major investment on a new digester or feed additives or whatever the technology might be, the last couple of years have been very difficult when they really are just trying to hang on to what they have.
Right, absolutely. Thank you for that. Eric, can you talk about transparency in your work?
Yeah, we've really based transparency a lot off of what Krista has shared in terms of being able to share what we're doing and admitting when we don't know things, but having more data from the industry and sharing that more broadly and publicly. Historically, across our membership, we had no history of collecting and sharing data in any collective way until a few years ago. And over the last few years, we're now in our third year, we have about 90% of our membership in the industry in the U.S. by volume reporting data to us on more than 100 metrics. So we're talking about climate metrics, we're talking about animal health and care metrics, food security, worker safety, trying to really have a collective approach towards sustainability. And we now put out reports on an annual basis, highlighting the data, highlighting the trends, and demonstrating what we're doing as an industry. We know that what we're doing isn't perfect. The data shows that. The data shows that we are not at 100% on things, but it gives us a roadmap for where we can continue to improve and allows us to talk about where we are and where we want to go.
Well, and I think it helps deflect some of the criticism that you get either fairly or unfairly from consumers and from others. If you have that to present, it's there, you can, really show it, right?
We have to have the proof points of what we're doing. And, in most cases, consumers aren't necessarily looking for all the details of what an industry or what a company is doing related to sustainability. But when they have that question, they want to know where to go and they want to know that they can find it.
Right.
And we have at an industry level that data, and we're equipping companies to be able to share that. So when a consumer wants to know where it is, it's there, it's public, and it's available.
Thank you. Martin, I feel like you're your work is based on transparency.
Indeed.
So, how do you help others sort of understand the real need for that?
Right. Well, our vision has to do with the whole value chain, right? From upstream to downstream, understanding both ends and every single stage in the middle. And we think that we're at a time where it's really important to have speakers that are prepared. And transparency has to do with trust.
Right.
So we need to build that trust first. And every message, it doesn't matter if it comes from a huge public multinational corporation or a farmers organization, we need, in all cases, to have speakers, to have messages that reflect and that transmit that trust.
Right.
Because too many documents, including the FAO's initial long shadow document.
A long time ago now, yeah.
Yeah, it's been 20 years,
Yep.
but it put on the table a lot of mistakes and
Sure.
misinterpretation of things.
Sure.
And for the normal citizen, urban citizen around the globe, what it meant is that what they were telling me about the quality of beef and the importance of ruminants
Yeah.
in ecosystems was wrong or was a lie.
Right.
And so I think we need to work on that and to keep in mind that trust is something that we need to work on and create. And if we don't devote to it, then it won't work.
Yeah, dispelling those myths is really important. Consumers are confused, though. And so I'm wondering from all of you, how can we help consumers to understand how they can eat better for themselves and for the planet? Do you want to go?
Yeah. I think we really need to help consumers or help urban persons to understand that we are nature. That nature is not something that happens elsewhere,
Right,
right?
yeah.
And if we live in a city, right, water does not come out of the tap, right, or the pipelines, right, or beef doesn't come out of a bag, right, a vacuum plastic bag,
Right.
that every service, every ecosystem service that we have, for example, the air that we breathe right here, has all this oxygen was not created from thin air.
Right.
It came from a plant that's somewhere, and there is someone, some person, some farmer that's been taking care of that plant. So I think we really need to work on our communications in a way that those that live all their lives in a city between concrete, steel, aluminum, and plastic get to understand that their life depends only on what happens on the ecosystems that are around the world.
That interconnectedness. Thank you for that. Beautifully said, Eric.
Yeah, I think consumers want to know more about how their food is produced, and that's really the biggest part of it. Is how can we bring information to consumers that demonstrates how their food is produced, producing it in line with what consumer expectations and values are. And so, the more that we can bring that forward, share those stories, have those proof points of what's being done, that I think that is a major step towards that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Krista, I recently had a conversation with New York Times columnist Kim Severson, who sort of was looking at how Gen Z responds to food marketing. And she said, they have, and excuse my language, they have incredible bullshit detectors. And it's not enough to see a happy cow on a carton of milk. They really want to know the story. And so I'm wondering, how the U.S. Dairy Export Council, how you can help consumers all over the world understand more about milk and some of, the challenges that farmers are facing, but also the successes that they're having.
Well, I just want to make it clear, happy cows do produce more milk. So that is a fact. But I'll also say that I think farmers and those of us involved in the industry have a responsibility too. We say, listen to our stories, trust us. You don't know what you're talking about. We do. I think it's flip side.
Yeah.
We've got to do a better job listening and understanding where the consumers are coming from, where the confusion is coming from, recognizing they're inundated with data, facts, non-facts, myths, whatever, all the time. And if you're sitting in downtown Atlanta, I'm from Georgia, or New York City, or name a city around the world, where are you getting your information? Who are you talking to? No wonder you're confused.
Right.
And we just have to appreciate that a little bit better. Go to where they are, listen to them, ask them about their source of information. Something that I do and have done for years is go to college campuses, non-land grant campuses where there's not a person there from a farm.
Right.
Or a small town like I grew up on,
Right.
and talk to them, listen to them, and ask them where do they get their information? How did they make a decision?
So smart.
And I learn probably as much or more than they do about their thought process, about what's motivating them. Well-meaning young people that we can kind of poo-poo and kind of laugh at and make a little fun of today, but they're the leaders tomorrow. They're the elected officials. They're the parents that are going to be the decision makers in a blink of an eye. We better understand them and where they're coming from. And I think that's our responsibility in agriculture. Very proud of our dairy farmers who open their farms at great risk.
They do.
At great risk to people. John was talking about, his farm in the UK. I know Maryland's, I've been there many, many times with school groups, with foreigners. All of just about all of our dairy farmers do that, and it is at risk. And so it's a two-way conversation. It's not just one-sided. We're not just telling a story. We better be listening to theirs as well.
We need that radical collaboration that Jack spoke so eloquently about. Thank you all. What a wonderful panel. It was really nice to talk to all of you. Please give them a round of applause. We're now turning it back to our friend, thank you so much, Dr. Mohammed Ibrahim, who will talk about key actions to help us for COP30. Please give him a round of applause as he joins the stage.
Thank you. And let me thank all the speakers and also the moderator for an excellent job that you've done. It's been a learning experience for me. I've an interest in this team, and there's a lot of take-home messages for me from this panel, also on the two panels that we have had. Now, let me start to say that the discussions were centered around putting farmers first, and in this whole discussion about how do you green the livestock sector, and addressing the issues from the consumers, from the policymakers, on what are the problems you're facing with livestock and what are the alternatives and what are the solutions. We have seen example where at the farm level, at the family farms, where managing livestock in a very sustainable way have contributed to improving the biodiversity, carbon sequestration, the soil, agrobiodiversity is also improved. I recall I was in Sweden in 1990, and I learned that the Swedish agriculture ministers took off livestock from the land, and then the biodiversity went down. So they put back the cattle there, and the biodiversity went up. And now we've seen some trend in terms of the policies. In Denmark, it is $100 per cow tax being implemented. New Zealand is also in a similar direction where they're paying for carbon if you're planting trees. So the discussion that one of the speakers mentioned of if you have the incentives, are you going to opt for producing food, or are you going to produce ecosystem services? I must say that examples in a country like Costa Rica, where it's been paying for ecosystem services, farmers have increased their productivity, but also have been conserving biodiversity in the forest. So we need to look at systemizing this information, and what are the policy and incentive environment that will enable sustainable practices, while at the same time balancing the environmental objectives and goals that we are discussing and using these examples. You also mentioned about the tax in terms of being, if you're a family farm, which can be a disincentive for the future generations in terms of continue family farming. And I think those are some of the policies that we need to look at in terms of how do you advance in scaling up these systems. The scenarios that Mr. Jack Bobo mentioned about the 3 scenarios, I think we need to make a good sound analysis of what are the trends that you're going to look in population growth, but also what are the consumers' trends in terms of what are they demanding for in terms of animal protein versus non-animal proteins. What scenarios will be the best for the livestock sector in terms of looking at the objectives of optimizing profits, but while at the same time complying with the environmental objectives and the climate goal objectives. So I think having some sound economic analysis, but also looking at some of the countries which is advancing and what will be the tendency will be very important. We know that many countries, especially in the southern cone, livestock is very important in the diets and will continue to be an important part. So it's very difficult to make these switches. We need to look at the cultural practices. What are people depending in the diets and daily food is very important. Also the partnerships, even when we disagree, which is also mentioned, how do we develop a common agenda, which is very important for us, preparing a toolbox and information systems where we inform farmers of the supply chain up to the restaurants and what they're demanding, providing them with information in terms of traceability. Already we've seen some countries advancing in terms of putting labels of how much carbon is being produced in the meat or traceability, including other traceability information that is needed with that. So we need to understand that, and the transparency, which is also mentioned, very important in these areas. In terms of in terms of the communication, here again, I think this is what ICA has been doing, is how do you educate people at different levels? The education is very important. We have been working on a campaign from the primary, from the secondary, up to technical schools and universities in terms of educating and providing information on the decision-making of the complexity of the farming systems, but also providing information based on the evidence of where are the competing claims in terms of how do we have sustainable livestock systems and how do we contribute to reducing the emissions. We underscore the importance of methane, for example, but also the advances we have made in terms of reducing the methane emissions in that. But also increasing the carbon pool from the soils. You mentioned 1 meter. We have been measuring the 1 meter depth also, especially if you have the agroforestry practices or silvopastoral systems. You try to deposit more carbon in the soil. And how do you create and increase this carbon sinks in that? In synthesis, I think that we are advancing in the right direction in terms of building a case for a greener livestock sector. We need to do more in terms of the communication and getting this information out to the consumers so that we're winning this debate based on science and policy. I think that's very important for us. Leading up to the COP, I think we need to continue this debate, working with the global roundtable for beef, working with the different policy and private sector organizations to generate more information and science, understanding where the knowledge gaps that we need to do work on. And I think here is where ICA as an institution can work together with you and continue on this discussion. So thank you very much.